Hi, I'm Dan Andersen with Iowa State Extension and Outreach, and I'm here today to talk about perennial ground cover in row crop cropping systems. This is a pretty large project funded by the USDA to work on can we come up with a cover crop that we only have to plant once and then manage instead of reestablishing every year to help with environmental services while we're producing our row crops. It's a pretty large project. It has partners with Corteva, the Land Institute, the University of Missouri, the University of Kentucky, and here at Iowa State University. So as part of this perennial ground cover project, we're trying to grow a perennial, in this case mostly grasses, with our corn or soybean species. And there's really a couple parts of the project where different teams are working on achieving a goal. The first one is, what corn should we select? We have a lot of experience with different corn hybrids, but all of a sudden we've changed the system where we've added a competition of a grass. And is it possible that certain varieties of corn compete better with the grass than others? That is, maybe they're less sensitive to seeing something green near them. So corn breeders on this project are helping to evaluate different genetics to see which ones might be best to pair with the ground cover. Additionally, we have people focusing on the ground cover. While we typically have grown Kentucky bluegrass, there are many other species that could be grown. Clovers, bulbous bluegrass, you name it, right? Depending on what we want to achieve. And trying to figure out which one works best in both space and time with the corn is really important to us. The third piece that we're really working on is the management of the system. Anytime you're growing something with corn, we want to focus on suppression. So in that case, I mean turning the grass brown. Some grasses will naturally senesce at the time we want. Poa bulbosa or bulbous bluegrass is one of them. Kentucky bluegrass, while it'll go dormant in the summer, tends to be a little late. So it can look, the corn can see it and say, oh no, competition, I have to put more resources into growing rather than focusing on yield, and that would be a bad thing. So we're working on how do we work on suppressing, turning it brown without actually killing it. So we have a group of scientists, including Corteva, focusing on what are some chemical options, and then another group focusing on can we make these grasses naturally senesce more rapidly in the spring so that they aren't that competition for corn. And finally, we have a group working to quantify the ecosystem services that we can get from that ground cover. So how much can it reduce erosion? How much nitrogen leaching can it reduce? What are the environmental benefits it adds? Along with that, we might be looking at things like, can we reduce a herbicide pass in the spring because we have that ground cover providing some plant or weed resistance? And what does it do for insects in the field? So it is a team of scientists really focused on all the aspects of the system. So anytime we're trying to do something new, one of the most important things to understand is how does it impact the current management of my farm? We generally in this system like to use strip till. The grass can be aggressive. Now, what we've seen is most of the time it takes a little while to get it established, so early on that's not a big issue. But if you get a vigorous stand of grass, doing some tillage, strip tillage, to knock it back from that crop zone can be extremely beneficial. And honestly, that's where most of our research work has been so far, is in a strip-tilled system. We do have some partners, some farmers collaborating, and then some of our research plots dedicated to no-till systems. That is something a little newer, and what we've been trying to do in those systems is band spray a herbicide where we're going to plant the corn. While the grass and the corn tend to grow at different times, that grass can provide some pretty stiff competition, and especially in dry springs, if the soil gets dried out, it can be hard to plant into. Certainly no-till planters do better with that, but getting some weed control is really helpful there. Now, if you are a full tillage person right now, this system has to be modified to do that. We can't be tilling through the grass. It really will knock it back and make it hard to maintain or establish. And when you compare this maybe to a traditional cover crop where we're trying to establish every year, the seed tends to be more expensive. It's more of a multiple year investment. But it is an investment in time and money that you only have to make hopefully that first year, and with good management we can get that grass to last multiple years. The second part we've seen is that oftentimes if you're growing a traditional cover crop, people are interested in potentially using it as a forage or grazing cattle on it. That worked great for something like cereal rye, where we tend to get a yield of 2 to 3 tons an acre of biomass. With Kentucky bluegrass, just like you might think for your front lawn, it doesn't tend to get as tall. So if you want a grazing cover crop, unfortunately this isn't it. With that said, there are other perennials that might be advantageous for that. Some people have looked at fescues as a potential grazing agent, and that can be really helpful. Now with that said, even though in this case we're probably in the neighborhood of a 1/4 to a 1/2 ton of above ground biomass from the cover crop, it can be helpful so that we're maintaining surface cover while we're letting some of our cattle out to graze the corn stover that would already be on the field in the fall. So grazing that residue is a pretty common practice, and oftentimes if we don't have a cover crop or a perennial ground cover, the soil can get pretty beat up, and we do end up with with some manure on the surface that if we get a large rainfall is prone to runoff and nutrient movement. The cover crop here can help with that. Additionally, while it's not going to provide a lot of fodder for your cattle, they still do like to eat it and munch on it, and it's pretty tasty as well. So they will graze it, but more so with the grazing, it's probably more for the corn stover. So I mentioned that perennial ground cover is really a multiple term investment. So the plots we're standing on today, this ground cover is about 6 years old. So it was established a fair while ago in the 2019s, and it's still persisting really well. And I think that's generally going to be the case actually. As it gets planted and established, it tends to be more aggressive. So we've had great luck maintaining it. Now there are some things that can damage it. If you need to take your equipment out in the field when it's kind of wet, you can cause some damage to that grass. It tends to come back, but it's sometimes noticeable and you might have to do some repair areas on that. Our goal is really a system that hopefully once you plant it once, can last for 15 to 20 years, maybe more. So it is a long-term investment. So the seed's more expensive, but some of the advantages are you only have to plant that one time and hopefully get to use it and absorb the benefits for a long period of time. I think a couple things to note. On the research side, we were really mostly concerned about our ability to manage the grass, right? To make sure it was turning brown and not cause yield goal. And actually the plots that we're standing on right now, that is one of their primary focuses, is how does grass management impact yield goal? And here they have a couple different types of grass. We have this Kentucky bluegrass that they manage both suppressed and unsuppressed. So we know with unsuppressed grass, you're going to take a yield hit. The research here suggests somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 bushels per acre per year at worst, and an average somewhere in the neighborhood of 30. Now when they suppress the bluegrass and get it suppressed well, in good years we're about yield neutral. In bad years where we've had some issues, maybe a small yield decrease of 5 to 10 bushels an acre. With the Poa bulbosa, and that is a grass that naturally senesces in the spring, it has been equivalent in yield to our control plots where we don't have any perennial ground cover growing. So I think there's lots of hope. And one of the visions of bulbous bluegrass is that there are certain genes that help it go dormant. And can we figure out what that is and breed it into that bluegrass? Because that is a management concern, right? While you're probably spraying for weed control anyway, the timing of that spray gets much more critical if we're trying to suppress a grass. So if we can make that a little more management friendly, the system will be a lot more robust. So while we aren't directly measuring water quality on these plots, we do have plots in other locations that are more astute for measuring water quality, particularly up in northeast Iowa at the Nashua Research Farm. There's tile drainage underneath those plots. We measure the center tile and have about 1 acre plots of Kentucky bluegrass. Starting this year, we planted some bulbous bluegrass this fall, so we'll have water quality data from both the Kentucky bluegrass plots and the bulbous bulbosa plots. On the Kentucky bluegrass plots we've had so far, we've been measuring those for about 3 years, and we've seen somewhere in the neighborhood of a 10 to 15% decrease in nitrogen movement down to that tile line. With that said, those are really dry years, so we're going to keep going. I think if we get more average weather conditions and a little more leaching, hopefully that bluegrass will shine through a little bit more. But in some of those years, we've had very little water movement down to the tile line. And while that's great from a nutrient loss standpoint, it does make the monitoring data a little less exciting from a research perspective, because if it doesn't flow there, it's hard to see. People have done some nice erosion control work, even here on the Sorensen farm, about 5 to 6 years ago, where there were some plots with some slope. The plots we're standing on right now are pretty flat, so it's hard to measure erosion. But originally when they started this, they actually had plots with 5 to 6% slope, put some drainage on the end of it to catch any water that was coming off the plots, and measured how much erosion was coming from them. And not a surprise, the Kentucky bluegrass, any perennial ground cover on the landscape, the roots are going to bind those soil particles together. The biomass itself acts as a shield to keep water from moving, and it's been very successful at that. So it's really that nitrogen standpoint where we're hoping to see some more data and understand how we're doing. So what are some management issues related to the bluegrass, and how tall does it get? You might be thinking, I mow my lawn all the time. Is this bluegrass going to get that tall? And a couple things. One, while it is highly fertilized in your cornfield, right, we're trying to grow a crop, there's a lot more competition here than what's on your lawn. And for the most part, especially if you're suppressing, which we will with a chemical in the spring to keep the bluegrass and turn it brown, we're only going to get somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 inches to a foot tall with our bluegrass. Sizable, but it's not going to be a huge competitor for corn. And then part of that is once that corn is up and established, the grass gets a lot of shade. So you've probably noticed underneath your trees, the grass tends to not be as vigorous, doesn't grow as tall as maybe it does in full sun. And that competition here helps keep the grass in check. So what we're worried about is the grass providing competition for the corn and impacting it negatively. That's why we're turning the grass down. But especially on that establishment side, the corn can be a competitor with the grass, right? So a few things. As we try and establish, if you look at when you'd want to plant a lawn, late September, early October is really the ideal time. And many of our Iowa cropping systems, that can be a struggle, right? We're still waiting for corn to get harvested. Maybe if you're planting an early maturity soybean, that gives us a great opportunity to get out and plant. But we definitely want some growth and some warmer days to help get that grass established in the fall. But in terms of how tall it will get, do you have to mow? You won't have to mow the grass, it'll be fine. For the most part, even if we get a foot tall, that residue or biomass breaks down in the next year. But it really does help provide some armor for the soil to help prevent some of that erosion potential, and hopefully provide some weed control. And here's one of the trade-offs that you see in this system. More biomass tends to lead to better weed control, but it also means more competition in the corn. So one of the things we're trying to figure out is how do you balance those three factors, right? Corn yield, erosion resistance, and the weed control that you get from it. And I think that's one of the things that we see in a lot of science right now is it's all about balancing trade-offs. We know that there's challenges to every system, but hopefully those benefits can outweigh the challenge. Yeah, so nutrient management is an extremely important topic, and the way we treated the grass so far is essentially that it is nutrient neutral. So whatever you were applying for fertilizer before, we're going to encourage you to apply the same amount. Now with that said, a couple things. We mentioned that we like to strip till this cornfield. So in that case, we'd like you to put your nutrients in that same strip. Now, some people will broadcast fertilize. You can certainly still do that. But if we're going to go to the investment of owning a piece of strip tillage equipment, managing our corn in that zone, which will be the zone shifted slightly every year, it makes a lot of sense, especially to accumulate phosphorus and potassium in that zone, maybe rather than broadcasting it all over. So I think another thing is, this is a really different looking system, and sometimes you might say, that's really pretty. For example, I grew up in central Wisconsin, and oftentimes we'd see a strip of alfalfa, a strip of corn. Not at this level, right, but at a field scale level. And certainly I think in Iowa, we've often been trained that clean fields, right, we don't want to see weeds or anything growing in our field, are really ideal. And in this case, that's not the goal, right? We're trying to grow that grass in there. So we have social scientists looking at what are some of the constraints that farmers have about these systems, what are their concerns. And one of them certainly is, what does it look like? How does it feel, right? What are my neighbors going to think and say? Certainly there's challenges to grass in the field. For a long time, especially if we go back 10, 20 years, we worried a lot about weed control, and that was one of the things that brought Roundup to the forefront. And here we're saying, yes, but there can be an ecosystem service benefit from that, but we have to learn how to manage it, right? And with weeds, our management strategy was often kill it. Make sure that the soil stays clean. Here we don't want that, but we certainly want the soil to be protected and that grass to turn brown. Corn has something called red near red indicator, where it uses that for the idea that there's a weed, right? So it measures reflectance and it says, if I see green, I think it's a weed. And while that grass won't compete with it for sunlight, it won't get nearly as tall, it still says, I'm a weed, I want to focus on growing tall, and that's not necessarily what we want with corn. So focusing on that hopefully will give us an idea of how to manage the grass. But it is really a change in mindset and what we're trying to achieve. And we recognize that there's some challenges to that, both from a research standpoint, but then in a social acceptance of how is it going to work on your farm and what are people going to think and say? Okay, as we finish up here today, there's a couple things that I wanted to mention. The first is we've been doing this for a little while now. And with that said, every year is different. Some falls are wet, some falls are dry. And at first we thought the major struggle of this system was really going to be management of the grass. We were concerned it was going to be too aggressive, and what are we going to do to make sure that it's not impacting the corn? And actually the last few years have been extremely dry, especially in the falls. And that's made establishment much more of a challenge than what we thought it would be. And we're trying to modify to understand that. So historically we'd planted mostly bluegrass. We're looking more towards some bluegrass mixtures, oftentimes with fescue now, because that's what we plant on lawns, right? And there's a reason that lawn mixes often have multiple species to help save and protect a certain one. So that's been one of our major lessons learned. The other one is that the grass can become really aggressive when it becomes well established. Management of that is critical. In the first couple of years, suppression of that grass is relatively easy. You're going to do a pretty good job. It's going to have minimal impact on yield almost no matter what you're doing. But it's important to practice good management during those years, because once it takes off, Making sure that we get that cropping zone and are keeping it clean around the corn is extremely important to avoid some yield loss. If you would like to learn more about the project or become involved, we do have a website, RegenPGC. So if you Google RegenPGC at Iowa State, you're going to find our website that has a list of all the projects going on, and we would be happy to take some farm collaborators. Now, we don't want you to put this on every acre on your farm, but if you're interested, we'd gladly help set up some plots or small test areas on your farm. We've had great luck, but it is weather dependent, so making sure we talk to you, know some of the challenges we faced in walking through the chemical mixes you can use are extremely important.